Commander Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UES Liberty and watched the stars streak past as they approached Centauri Prime. His hands gripped the metal railing as he thought about the mission ahead. 3 million people on Kepler 442b needed help, and the human government was sending Ambassador Lisa Carter to ask the Galactic Council for aid. Jake had transported many diplomats before, but this felt different. The solar flares hitting the mining colony were getting worse each day, and time was running out. Lisa Carter walked onto the bridge carrying a datapad filled with reports about the crisis. She was a small woman with gray hair, but her voice carried the weight of authority when she spoke. Jake had worked with her twice before and knew she never gave up on anything. She looked at the view screen showing the massive space station that housed the Galactic Council and shook her head. The station was bigger than most cities and gleamed with cold metal surfaces that reflected no warmth. The Liberty docked at Port 7, and Jake accompanied the ambassador to the council chambers. The hallways were wide and sterile with white walls that hurt the eyes. Alien beings moved through the corridors with purpose but showed no interest in the humans walking among them. Jake noticed how quiet everything was despite the crowds. No one spoke unless necessary, and when they did speak, their voices carried no emotion. The council chamber was a vast circular room with seats arranged in perfect geometric patterns. Representatives from dozens of species sat in their designated areas and waited for the session to begin. Jake took his place in the observer section while Ambassador Carter walked to the center of the room. The Zephyrians sat to the left with their scaled green skin and yellow eyes that never blinked. The Helix Collective occupied the right side, and their insect-like bodies clicked and buzzed as they communicated through chemical signals. The Lumina floated above everyone else as balls of pure energy that pulsed with different colors. Council Leader Vex 7 of the Helix Collective called the session to order. His voice came through a translator that made every word sound mechanical and cold. Ambassador Carter stepped forward and began her presentation about the Kepler colony. She explained how the solar flares were increasing in intensity and frequency. The radiation was making the planet impossible to live on, and the 3 million colonists needed immediate evacuation. Jake watched the alien faces as Lisa spoke about families with children who had lived on Kepler for generations. She showed pictures of the mining communities and the schools where human children learned alongside alien refugees who had found safety on the planet. She talked about the elderly people who were too weak to survive the radiation exposure and the pregnant women who needed medical care that the colony could no longer provide. The ambassador's voice grew stronger as she described the human values that made evacuation necessary. She spoke about duty to protect the innocent and the moral obligation to save lives regardless of cost. Jake could see passion in her eyes as she asked the council to provide ships and resources for the rescue operation. She offered to pay any reasonable price and promised that humanity would repay the debt over time. When Ambassador Carter finished speaking, the chamber fell silent. The aliens looked at each other with expressions that Jake could not read. Some made soft clicking sounds while others flashed different colored lights. After several minutes of this alien communication, council leader Vex 7 spoke again. His words came through the translator with the same mechanical tone as before. The Helix leader explained that the council had calculated the economic cost of evacuating Kepler 442b. The number of ships required would disrupt trade routes for 3 months. The fuel consumption would create shortages in 12 other systems. The temporary housing needed for 3 million refugees would strain resources on multiple worlds. He paused and let these facts sink in before delivering the final verdict. The cost of evacuation exceeded the economic value of the colonists by a factor of 4.7. The council had determined that the resources could be better used elsewhere to benefit a larger number of beings. The request for aid was denied and the session was closed. Ambassador Carter stood frozen in the center of the room as the alien representatives began filing out. Jake felt something burning in his chest as he watched the aliens leave. None of them looked back at the human ambassador, who remained standing alone in the middle of the chamber. They had just condemned 3 million people to death. and showed no more emotion than if they had rejected a request for office supplies. The cold calculation that guided their decision made Jake's hands shake with anger he had never felt before. Ambassador Carter walked back to where Jake waited, and her face showed the shock of complete defeat. She had expected negotiation or perhaps demands for payment, but never this clinical dismissal of human life. As they left the council chamber together, Jake realized that something fundamental separated humans from the other species in the galaxy. The aliens had forgotten something that humans still carried inside them, and Jake was beginning to understand what that something might be. Jake Morrison sat in the archives beneath New Geneva. 3 weeks after returning from Centauri Prime, the smell of old books mixed with the hum of data, terminals as he searched through centuries of human history, he could not stop thinking about the cold way the Galactic Council had dismissed 3 million lives, and something deep inside him demanded answers. The ancient texts and digital records spread across his table told stories of a time when humans lived by different rules. Dr. Elena Rodriguez found him there at midnight reading about medieval knights and their codes of honor. She was a xenocultural anthropologist who studied how different species developed their value systems, and Jake had called her for help understanding what made humans different. Elena sat down across from him and looked at the pile of books about chivalry and knighthood that surrounded his workspace. Jake showed Elena a passage about knights who protected the innocent without expecting payment or reward. These warriors took vows to defend those who could not defend themselves and lived by codes that valued honor above profit. Elena nodded as she read and explained that every species in the galaxy had once possessed similar concepts but abandoned them when they reached the stars. The transition to space travel required massive resources and cooperation that could only be achieved through pure logic and economic calculation. The Zephyrians had once been a warrior culture with strict honor codes, but gave up these traditions when they discovered faster than light travel. The Helix Collective had evolved from individual creativity to hive mind efficiency because emotional attachments hindered their expansion across multiple star systems. Even the Lumina had abandoned their artistic nature to focus on the mathematical precision needed for interstellar civilization. Every species learned that survival in space required abandoning what they called inefficient emotional attachments. Elena pulled up holographic displays showing the development of galactic civilization over the past 10,000 years. Each species that joined the interstellar community underwent the same transformation from honor-based societies to purely pragmatic ones. The galaxy rewarded cold calculation and punished emotional decision-making until concepts like chivalry and sacrifice became extinct. What the aliens saw as evolution humans might call the death of the soul. While Jake studied ancient history, the situation on KEPLER 442b grew worse each day. Mayor Ben Collins sent increasingly desperate messages to Earth Command describing the radiation levels that made outdoor work impossible. The colony's children were developing sickness from exposure, and the elderly were dying faster than the medical centers could treat them. The solar flares showed no signs of stopping, and scientists predicted the planet would be uninhabitable within 2 months. Earth Command ordered all ships to maintain their current assignments and avoid unauthorized missions to Kepler. The official policy stated that evacuation without Galactic Council approval would damage humanity's relationship with other species and potentially result in economic sanctions. Admiral Frank Patterson made it clear that any captain who disobeyed orders would face court-martial and loss of command. The human government chose diplomatic caution over immediate action. Jake read these orders while studying a text about Sir Galahad, and felt the same burning sensation in his chest that had started at the council meeting. The knight in the story chose to help strangers despite orders from his king and accepted exile rather than abandon innocent people to danger. Jake looked at his commission as a commander in the human fleet and realized he faced the same choice that had confronted knights 1,000 years earlier. The UES Liberty was scheduled for a routine patrol of the outer system, but Jake changed course toward Kepler 442b without reporting to Earth Command. His crew of 43 officers and enlisted personnel noticed the navigation change, but no one questioned the decision. Lieutenant Amy Thompson simply asked how many evacuees they could fit in the cargo bays, and Chief Engineer Carlos Williams began calculating life support requirements for additional passengers. Jake's unauthorized rescue mission reached Kepler 3 days later and found a planet wrapped in radiation storms that lit the sky with deadly colors. The mining stations had been abandoned and most of the population had crowded into underground shelters that provided minimal protection from the solar bombardment. Mayor Collins met Jake at the primary evacuation site and could barely speak through his relief at seeing a human ship arrive. The Liberty could only carry 800 people per trip and would need 6 round trips to evacuate the most vulnerable colonists. Jake knew that Earth Command would discover his disobedience before he could complete even 2 trips, but he began loading elderly and sick passengers anyway. Something inside him had awakened that made following orders less important than saving lives, and he could not explain this feeling to anyone, including himself. Admiral Patterson contacted Jake during the second evacuation run and demanded an explanation for the unauthorized mission. Jake stood on his bridge surrounded by refugee children who laughed despite their fear and tried to find words for what drove him to disobey orders. The only thing he could say was that it felt like the right thing to do, even if regulations and logic said otherwise. The Admiral threatened court-martial, but Jake continued loading passengers. Elena arrived on Kepler aboard a medical transport she had commandeered from the research station where she worked. She brought supplies and additional crew to help with the evacuation, but more importantly, she brought an understanding of what was happening to Jake and others like him. She explained that humans were remembering something the galaxy had forgotten, and this memory was stronger than fear of punishment or concern for careers. As Jake watched Elena treat sick children with medicine she had stolen from her laboratory, he realized that the ancient codes were not really ancient at all. They lived inside every human and waited for the right moment to emerge. The galaxy had forgotten about knights, but humanity was about to remind them what honor looked like in action rather than words. News of Jake Morrison's rescue mission spread through the human fleet faster than official communications could suppress it. Captain Helen Barnes abandoned her patrol route near the Vega system when she heard about the Kepler evacuation and arrived with her ship, the UES Guardian, loaded with medical supplies and food. Commander Paul Martinez left his post protecting a trade convoy to help transport refugees and brought 3 other ships, whose captains had made the same choice without consulting their orders. The unauthorized fleet grew to 12 ships within a week as more commanders chose to help rather than follow regulations. Each captain who arrived at Kepler faced the same decision that had confronted Jake, and each one chose to act on instincts that ran deeper than military discipline. Lieutenant Amy Thompson coordinated the rescue flights while Chief Engineer Carlos Williams worked around the clock to modify cargo bays for passenger transport. The evacuation became a race against time as the solar flares increased in intensity. Admiral Frank Patterson received reports about the growing rebellion in his fleet and realized he faced a crisis that no military manual had prepared him for. 12 of his best commanders had abandoned their posts to conduct an illegal rescue operation, and more ships were heading toward Kepler every day. The political pressure from Earth Command demanded immediate action to restore order, but something about the situation made Patterson hesitate before issuing arrest warrants. The Admiral spent 3 sleepless nights reviewing personnel files and service records of the officers involved in the Kepler mission. Every one of them had exemplary careers with commendations for courage and leadership under fire. These were not troublemakers or rebels, but the finest officers in the human fleet, and their sudden disobedience suggested something more significant than simple insubordination. Patterson began reading the same historical text that Jake had studied and slowly understood what was happening to his people. Patterson called a secret meeting aboard his flagship with Jake and the other commanders who had joined the rescue operation. The conference room was crowded with officers who expected to face court-martial proceedings, but instead found their admiral asking questions about duty and honor. Patterson had discovered the same medieval codes that Jake found in the archives and wanted to understand how ancient concepts could override modern military discipline so completely. Jake explained that the sight of aliens dismissing human lives as economic calculations had awakened something that felt older than civilization itself. The codes of chivalry were not outdated traditions but fundamental truths about what separated sentient beings from mere survival machines. Every human carried these truths inside them, and the Galactic Council's cold pragmatism had triggered an instinctive response that no amount of training could suppress. The other commanders nodded as Jake spoke because they had felt the same awakening. Admiral Patterson listened to his officers describe their feelings about protecting innocence regardless of cost or regulation and realized that humanity was rediscovering its essential nature. The galaxy had forced every species to abandon honor in favor of efficiency, but humans had somehow preserved the capacity for noble action. Patterson made a decision that would change the course of galactic history when he chose to support rather than punish the rescue operation. The Admiral established the Solar Knights as an official organization within the human fleet dedicated to protecting innocent life throughout the galaxy. The name came from Elena Rodriguez, who had continued her research into knightly traditions while treating refugees on Kepler. The Solar Knights would operate under a simple code that valued courage, honor, mercy, valor, faith, and nobility above profit or political advantage. Membership was voluntary, but every human officer who learned about the organization immediately requested to join. The first major test of the Solar Knights came when the Tauran system requested help defending their agricultural worlds from the Crimson Syndicate. The Syndicate was a loose alliance of pirate fleets that specialized in raiding farming planets and enslaving the populations for sale to mining operations. Tauran Prime and its 6 colony worlds supported nearly 200 million beings who had no military forces capable of resisting the approaching armada. The Galactic Council received the Tauran request for military assistance and spent 4 days calculating the economic costs of intervention. The Council determined that the agricultural output of the Tauran system was not valuable enough to justify the expense of deploying defensive fleets. The pirates would likely maintain food production using slave labor, so the economic disruption would be minimal. Council leader Vex 7 announced that the Tauran system was outside the sphere of galactic protection, and the inhabitants would need to negotiate their own terms with the Syndicate. Jake Morrison received this news while completing the final evacuations from Kepler 442b and felt the same burning anger that had started his transformation into a knight. The Solar Knights had sworn to protect the innocent and 200 million beings on Tauran Prime faced slavery or death while the galaxy watched with cold indifference. Admiral Patterson authorized the deployment of 27 human ships to defend the Tauran system despite having no legal authority to conduct military operations outside human space. The Used Liberty led the small fleet toward Tauran Prime while Jake tried to calculate odds that looked impossible. The Crimson Syndicate commanded over 300 ships, including captured military vessels with heavy weapons and armor. The human force was outnumbered more than 10 to 1 and would be fighting far from any hope of reinforcement or resupply. Logic suggested that the mission was suicide, but logic had never been the driving force behind knightly action. Captain Helen Barnes brought the Guardian alongside the Liberty as the fleet prepared to enter the Tauran system and opened a communication channel to speak with Jake. She had been thinking about the odds of survival and wanted to confirm that every member of the Solar Knights understood the likely outcome of the coming battle. Jake looked at the determination in her eyes and realized that fear of death mattered less than fear of living without honor. The human fleet dropped out of faster than light travel at the edge of the Tauran system and immediately detected the massive pirate armada moving toward the inhabited worlds. Jake opened communications to all ships and spoke the words that would become the battle cry of the Solar Knights. He reminded his fellow knights that they fought not for glory or conquest, but for those who could not fight for themselves. The phrase, "for those who cannot fight for themselves," echoed across every human ship as they prepared to face impossible odds in defense of strangers they had never met. The Battle of Tauran Prime began when the Crimson Syndicate detected the human fleet and immediately changed course to engage what they considered an insignificant obstacle. Pirate Lord Krex commanded the syndicate from his massive dreadnought. Death's fortune and could not understand why 27 small ships would challenge his armada of 300 vessels. The pirates had faced military opposition before but never encountered warriors who seemed to welcome impossible odds. Jake Morrison positioned the Liberty between the pirate fleet and the civilian evacuation ships that were fleeing Torin Prime. The planet's population had no military experience, but they were not completely helpless in thousands of small craft launched from the surface carrying families toward the outer system. The Solar Knights spread their formation wide to create a protective screen that would force the pirates to fight through human ships before reaching the refugees. Captain Ryan Torres commanded the Use Valor and had served with Jake for 5 years before joining the Solar Knights. His ship was one of the smallest in the human fleet, but Torres positioned it directly in the path of the pirate advance and opened fire on vessels 10 times larger than his own. The Valor's weapons barely scratched the armor of the syndicate ships, but Torres continued attacking even as return fire began tearing his vessel apart. The pirates expected the humans to retreat when they realized how badly outnumbered they were, but instead watched the small fleet charge forward into the heart of the syndicate formation. Captain Helen Barnes led her Guardian in a desperate assault on the pirate command ship, while her weapons officer, Chief Petty Officer Lisa Brooks, coordinated targeting data with the other human vessels. The Guardian took massive damage from concentrated fire, but refused to break off the attack. The space around Torin Prime filled with explosions and debris as the battle intensified. Chief Engineer Carlos Williams kept the Liberty's engines running despite direct hits that should have crippled the ship, and Lieutenant Amy Thompson coordinated rescue operations for human crews whose vessels had been disabled. The Solar Knights fought with a ferocity that confused the pirates because the humans seemed to care more about protecting the evacuation ships than preserving their own lives. Pirate Lord Krex became frustrated as his overwhelming numerical advantage failed to produce the quick victory he expected. The human ships used tactics that made no logical sense because they willingly sacrificed strategic positions to shield civilian vessels from attack. When the UES Defender was surrounded by 6 pirate ships, Captain Robert Chun ordered his crew to ram the largest enemy vessel rather than surrender. The collision destroyed both ships but cleared a path for 3 refugee transports to escape. The turning point came when Captain Ryan Torres realized that his damaged Valor could no longer contribute to the battle but still had enough power for one final action. He set course for the Death's Fortune and broadcast a message to every ship in the system declaring that a true knight protects all life even at the cost of his own. The Valor accelerated toward the pirate dreadnought as Torres transferred all remaining power to engines and weapons. The collision between the Valor and Death's Fortune created an explosion visible from the surface of Torin Prime. The pirate flagship was crippled but not destroyed, and Pirate Lord Krex survived to see his command structure in chaos. More importantly, the sacrifice of Torres and his crew had been witnessed by every being in the system, including the Torin defenders, who had been watching the battle from their doomed planet. Something changed in the Torin resistance when they saw humans dying to protect strangers. The planet's small defense force had been preparing to surrender, but now they launched their outdated fighters in a desperate attempt to support the Solar Knights. Civilian ships that had been fleeing the system turned around and joined the battle, despite having no weapons stronger than mining lasers. The concept of self-sacrifice for others spread like wildfire through beings who had never seen such behavior before. Jake Morrison received damage reports showing that half his fleet was either destroyed or disabled, but the evacuation continued under the protection of the surviving Solar Knights. The Liberty had lost most of its weapons and life support was failing, but Jake positioned his ship between the largest pirate formation and a convoy of refugee ships carrying Torin children. The pirates concentrated their fire on the Liberty as Jake broadcast the chivalric code across all communication frequencies. The words courage, honor, mercy, valor, faith, and nobility echoed through space as Jake's ship absorbed punishment that should have vaporized it instantly. Chief Engineer Carlos Williams performed miracles to keep critical systems running while the hull cracked and atmosphere vented into space. The Liberty was dying, but refused to move aside and allow the pirates to reach the defenseless civilians it protected. The battle reached its climax when reinforcements arrived from an unexpected source. Ships from the Auroran Compact dropped out of faster-than-light travel and immediately engaged the pirate fleet. The Aurorans had been monitoring the fight and were moved by the human display of selfless courage to abandon their traditional neutrality. Admiral Zara Keth of the Compact Fleet opened communications with Jake and declared that some things were more important than political considerations. The arrival of Auroran reinforcements tilted the balance just enough for the Solar Knights to complete their mission. The remaining evacuation ships escaped to safety while the combined human and Auroran forces drove off the surviving pirates. Pirate Lord Krex retreated with less than half his original fleet and swore revenge against the humans who had destroyed his reputation for invincibility. The Crimson Syndicate would rebuild, but they would never again underestimate warriors who fought for honor rather than profit. Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of his battered ship and watched the refugee convoy disappear into faster-than-light travel, carrying 200 million Tauran civilians to safety. The cost had been enormous, with 12 human ships destroyed and hundreds of crew members dead, but every life saved justified the sacrifice. The Solar Knights had proven that the ancient codes could triumph over impossible odds when warriors chose honor over survival. News of the Solar Knights' victory at Tauran Prime spread across the galaxy faster than any government could suppress it. For the first time in millennia, beings throughout known space witnessed warriors who fought for ideals rather than profit, and the impact was immediate and profound. Young aliens from dozens of species began questioning the purely pragmatic values that had dominated galactic civilization for thousands of years. A Zephyrian pilot named Keshmor Dai arrived at the human fleet base on Luna 3 weeks after the battle and requested an audience with Jake Morrison. She had watched the recordings of human ships sacrificing themselves to protect Tauran civilians and could not understand the motivation behind such actions. Keshmor Dai had lived her entire life calculating advantage and measuring success by efficiency, but the Solar Knights had shown her something that transcended mathematical logic. Jake met with the young Zephyrian in the same archives where he had first discovered the knightly codes and tried to explain concepts that had no equivalent in her language. The idea of protecting others without expectation of reward seemed impossible to Keshmor Dai because her species had abandoned such thinking when they reached the stars. Jake showed her the ancient texts about chivalry and honor, while Elena Rodriguez provided translation for concepts that Zephyrian culture had forgotten. The meeting lasted for 6 hours as Keshmor Dai struggled to understand how warriors could choose certain death over tactical retreat. Jake explained that true strength came not from winning battles, but from standing against darkness regardless of the odds. The young Zephyrian finally grasped the concept when Jake told her that knights fought not for themselves but for those who came after them. She asked to join the Solar Knights and become the first non-human member of the organization. Dr. Elena Rodriguez established academies on 3 worlds to teach knightly virtues to beings from across the galaxy. The schools operated in secret because the Galactic Council had declared the Solar Knights a terrorist organization, but students arrived anyway, seeking to learn about honor and sacrifice. Elena discovered that every species retained dim memories of their own codes of conduct from before they reached the stars, and these memories could be awakened with proper instruction. The movement spread despite official suppression as young beings found purpose in something greater than personal advancement. Auroran merchants began providing covert support to the academies, while Lumina scholars secretly studied human philosophy for the first time in centuries. Even some members of the normally unified Helix Collective began showing signs of individual thinking that their leaders found disturbing and dangerous. Council leader Vex 7 recognized the threat that human idealism posed to the established galactic order and began deploying assassination squads to eliminate Solar Knight leaders. The Helix Collective had maintained control for 3,000 years, by ensuring that all decisions were based on logical calculation rather than emotional attachment. The emergence of beings willing to die for strangers represented a virus that could destroy the foundation of interstellar civilization. The first assassination attempt targeted Jake Morrison while he was visiting the Academy on Rigel 7-3. Helix agents infiltrated the facility and would have succeeded except for the intervention of Kesh Mordi, who had been assigned as Jake's bodyguard. The young Zephyrian killed 2 attackers and died protecting the human who had taught her about honor. Her sacrifice demonstrated that the knightly code could inspire beings from any species. Admiral Frank Patterson received intelligence reports about planned attacks on Solar Knight facilities and realized that the conflict was escalating beyond simple military operations. The Galactic Council was preparing to use force to eliminate what they called the honor infection before it could spread further. Patterson made the decision to openly break with Galactic Authority when Earth Command ordered him to disband the Solar Knights and arrest their leaders. The Admiral called a press conference that was broadcast throughout human space and declared Earth's withdrawal from the Galactic Federation. Patterson explained that humanity could not remain part of an organization that viewed compassion as a disease and sacrifice as a mental disorder. The speech ended with words that would be remembered for generations when Patterson stated that humans chose honor over membership in a soulless bureaucracy. The withdrawal from the Federation triggered economic sanctions that cut off trade routes and isolated human worlds from galactic commerce. Earth's government initially condemned Patterson's action, but public support for the Solar Knights was overwhelming. Demonstrations in every major city demanded that humanity stand by its principles regardless of the economic cost. The sanctions strengthened rather than weakened human resolve to defend their newfound purpose. Other species began following humanity's example as the movement continued to spread. The Tauran survivors established their own knightly order and dedicated themselves to protecting refugee populations throughout the galaxy. Several Auroran captains resigned their commissions to join the Solar Knights while young. Lumina entities abandoned their collective consciousness to embrace individual moral responsibility. The concept of noble sacrifice was taking root across dozens of worlds. Council Leader Vex 7 realized that half measures would not contain the growing rebellion and began planning a massive military assault on Earth itself. The Helix Collective commanded the largest fleet in the galaxy and could easily overwhelm human defenses if they acted quickly. Vex 7 calculated that destroying the source of the honor infection would allow galactic civilization to return to its previous state of logical efficiency. The decision to attack Earth united every faction of humanity behind the Solar Knights. Even politicians who had opposed withdrawal from the Federation now supported Admiral Patterson as reports arrived of the approaching Helix Armada. Jake Morrison received command of the rebuilt U.S. Excalibur and began coordinating the defense of humanity's homeworld. The final battle between honor and calculation was about to begin. Elena Rodriguez worked frantically to complete evacuation of the knightly academies while Jake prepared for a fight that would determine whether noble ideals could survive in a universe that had forgotten their value. The galaxy was watching to see if the humans who had reminded the stars about knights could defend their own world against overwhelming odds. The answer would reshape civilization throughout known space. The Helix Collective's massive armada emerged from faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Sol system with overwhelming force designed to end the honor infection permanently. Council leader Vex 7 commanded 1,500 warships including captured vessels from every species in the galaxy, and he expected human resistance to collapse within hours. The logical calculation was simple because no rational beings would fight hopeless battles when surrender offered survival. Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UES Excalibur and watched the enemy fleet approach while Earth's defenses prepared for their final stand. The human fleet numbered only 300 ships, but many carried crews from other species who had embraced the knightly code. Kesh Morde's sister Velshari commanded a squadron of Zephyrian fighters while former Auroran Admiral Zaraketh brought her entire battle group to defend humanity's homeworld. The first phase of the battle began when advanced scouts from both Fleets engaged near Jupiter's outer moons. Captain Helen Barnes led the reconnaissance force aboard her new ship UES Guardian II and immediately realized the scope of the enemy armada. The Helix Collective had brought enough firepower to destroy Earth's defenses 10 times over, but Barnes transmitted her findings to Jake. Without any suggestion of retreat or surrender, Earth's orbital defense platforms opened fire as the enemy fleet reached the inner system and massive energy beams lanced through space toward the approaching armada. The Helix vessels absorbed the defensive fire without significant damage and continued their advance toward the planet that had spawned the warriors they had come to eliminate. Vex 7 broadcast a demand for unconditional surrender, but received only silence from the human fleet. Jake Morrison deployed his forces in a defensive formation that surrounded Earth and made it impossible for the enemy to attack the planet without fighting through every human ship. The strategy guaranteed maximum casualties for the defenders, but also ensured that the Helix Collective would pay the highest possible price for their victory. Chief Engineer Carlos Williams had modified every human vessel to overload their reactors if necessary rather than allow capture. The main battle erupted when the two fleets collided in the space between Earth and Mars. Captain Ryan Torres Jr. commanded the Use Valor II, in honor of his father who died at Torum Prime, and led the first wave of human ships into the heart of the enemy formation. The younger Torres had inherited his father's courage along with his name and proved worthy of both when he rammed his damaged vessel into a helix. Dreadnought Elena Rodriguez coordinated medical efforts from the hospital ship UES Mercy while watching the most important battle in galactic history unfold around her. The conflict was more than military because it would determine whether beings throughout the galaxy would remember what it meant to fight for something greater than themselves. Every human death brought the enemy closer to Earth but also demonstrated the power of sacrifice to inspire others. The tide began to turn when unexpected reinforcements arrived from across the galaxy. Ships from species that had never cooperated before dropped out of faster-than-light travel and immediately engaged the Helix fleet. Tauran defenders who had learned courage from human example fought alongside Auroran merchants who had abandoned neutrality. Even some Lumina entities manifested physical forms to join the battle against tyrannical logic. Admiral Frank Patterson coordinated the arriving reinforcements while Jake Morrison pressed the attack against the enemy command ship. The diversity of species fighting together would have been impossible under the old galactic order, but the Solar Knights had shown beings that honor transcended racial and cultural differences. The combined fleet still faced overwhelming odds, but unity of purpose multiplied their effectiveness. The battle reached its climax when Jake's Excalibur broke through the enemy defensive screen and engaged Vex 7's flagship in single combat. The two ships circled each other while their weapons carved paths of destruction through space, and Jake realized he faced a choice that would define the outcome of everything. He could destroy the Helix command ship and ensure victory, but thousands of enemy crew members would die, or he could attempt capture and risk losing the entire battle. Jake chose mercy and led a boarding action against the enemy flagship instead of simply destroying it. The decision violated every principle of tactical warfare but embodied the knightly ideal that true strength showed itself through restraint rather than overwhelming force. The assault teams fought through the corridors of the Helix ship, while Jake's own vessel absorbed punishment from supporting enemy vessels. The boarding action succeeded when Jake's team reached the command center and captured Council Leader Vex 7. Alive. The Helix leader had expected death and defeat but found himself facing a human who offered quarter even to those who would have shown no mercy. Jake's decision to spare his enemies demonstrated the fundamental difference between knights and conquerors and proved that honor could triumph without becoming what it fought against. Vex 7 asked Jake why he had chosen mercy when victory through destruction was certain and easier. Jake explained that a true knight protected all life, including those who threatened him, because the alternative was to become the darkness they fought against. The concept was incomprehensible to the Helix leader, who had spent his existence calculating advantage, but he began to understand that some things transcended Mathematical logic. The surrender of the Helix flagship ended the battle as remaining. Enemy ships lost coordination and began withdrawing from the system. Jake's victory was complete, but more importantly, it was achieved through methods that honored the code he had sworn to follow. The galaxy had witnessed warriors who could show restraint in the moment of triumph, and this demonstration of controlled power impressed beings. More than any display of destructive capability, the establishment of the new Galactic Covenant followed. Within months, as species throughout known space demanded representation in a government based on principles of honor and justice rather than pure efficiency. The Solar Knights became the Covenant's peacekeeping force with academies on hundreds of worlds teaching the ancient virtues to new generations. Council leader Vex 7 himself enrolled in one of these schools and slowly learned to value concepts he had spent millennia rejecting. Jake Morrison stood on the observation deck of the orbital academy above Earth and watched young knights from a dozen species practice their oaths of service. The ceremony was simple but profound as beings from across the galaxy swore to protect the innocent and defend the helpless regardless of cost or reward. The words echoed through space and carried the promise that darkness would always face opposition. From those willing to stand against it, the transformation was not complete, and would never be finished because each generation had to choose honor over convenience. But the galaxy had remembered what it meant to be noble, and that memory would endure as long as beings were willing to fight for something greater than themselves. The stars had forgotten about knights until humanity returned them, and now the ancient codes would guide civilization toward a future worthy of the sacrifice required to achieve it.